Spin Cycle Studio.
Hello everybody and welcome to Spin Cycle Studios, the channel where we aim to answer studio-related questions without wasting too much of your time. Today we look at an interesting topic. What is the analog sound? This is a question that's been tossed around and answered by a million different people on YouTube and elsewhere, but essentially it boils down to the idea of digital recordings versus analog recordings, and the fact that back in the day, the analog recording world sounded warmer, had more texture, felt more natural, had a certain thickness to it, whereas the word nowadays is that digital recordings are kind of dry and sterile. So what is that analog sound? What can we do here in the home studio to kind of achieve that analog sound? As mentioned, we're talking about getting a warm, colorful sound in your recordings. This is typically done by recording through some type of physical, music-related hardware that imprints its own sonic character on the sound. There's also a lot of plugins these days that, free and paid, give you what many would say is the analog sound, but it's kind of hard to measure because how can you measure something like warmth, saturation, all those kinds of things? You know, there's different tools to measure, but I want to explore something that's kind of underlooked, but super obvious when it comes to analog gear, analog hardware, analog plugin emulations, and that's EQ response. Because I think a big part of the analog sound, aside from the supposed gooiness, is the way that the hardware and the hardware emulations affect the EQ response of whatever you put through them. So let's pop into the computer. I've taken some screenshots of some EQ response curves that I've been able to graph using the Bertum Audio plugin EQ Analyzer 2. And let's see what these hardware units and analog emulations are actually doing to your signal, and how even in their default state there's a huge imprint on the sound. Let's check it out. Alright everyone, so we're here at the computer and we're just basically gonna put up some screenshots and talk about what we see. First here we've got a screenshot up of a flat EQ response curve. This is what a straight digital recording would see. This is what most modern interfaces will put out with their mic preamps. It's just a flat EQ response, nothing's affecting it. We'll go to the next screenshot here, and so this is the interface that I use for my recording. This is a Volt 4. Essentially this is the EQ response of the microphone preamp without the vintage mode engaged. This is just the flat mic preamp, and as you can see, it's pretty damn flat. Nothing boosted or nothing cut. It's just a nice flat response, good to give you a baseline. Now we're talking about analog gear. So I've got this Focusrite Platinum Voice Master channel strip, which includes a preamp that has a little bit of a saturation control on it. So when I just dial in the saturation to maybe like 5%, I end up with this. That's a picture of the preamp there at the top, and as you can see, the preamp is doing a huge presence boost from everything up, basically from 300 hertz and up, has a nice boost to it, topping out at about 5 or 6K, and that's just what is supposed to be a neutral preamp with a little bit of saturation added. That's what it does to it. As you'll see, we can kind of move on into emulations of plugins, emulations of hardware. Here we have the Brit Pre from Analog Obsession. It's essentially a Neve preamp emulated, and as you can see, it's not a huge shift, but there is a bump at about 150 hertz, and then there's a bit of a presence boost, you know, just kind of up from there, up around 1K. It's minor, but it's there. It's just kind of tone shaping, right? A more extreme analog emulation is something like the UAD Century tube channel strip. So this is essentially an emulation of an old tube channel strip from a console. And as you can see, there's a huge roll off under 100 hertz and above basically like 6K. It's just kind of smoothing it out and on both ends and really not letting any super lows or super highs come through and giving you more of that vintage tube warm kind of sound. Keep in mind, this is on its default setting. All these ones that I'm going to show you is just basically the default setting, just to show that the analog emulation itself, at its default, its whole purpose is to create that analog vibe. And EQ response wise, it seems to be that there's a roll off in the high end, there's a roll off in the lows, and there's always kind of something in the mid range going on to give it some character. After channel strips and preamps, we can talk about things like analog emulations of tape machines and vinyl machines and stuff like that. So we're looking at isotope vinyl on the 1970s setting. This is as it is in the screenshot. No dust or scratch or any of that added. This is just the emulation of the frequency response of a 70s vinyl record. And as you can see, everything below like 200 hertz is just lopped off, and there's basically nothing above 10K either. So I mean, like, when you think about that vintage sound and what those old records sound like, it's not the modern big bass, super sparkly top end, and it shows it in the vinyl emulation. We've got another one here, even a compressor, even a UA LA2A with a lot of peak reduction. Admittedly, I needed to get it to react. Even just compression, sending it through a famous type of tube compressor affects the EQ response. You can see basically flat up until maybe like 2 or 3K, and then it starts to get a big, nice presence boost. So that's pretty cool. Things like tape machines. People are always putting tape machine emulations to add glue and saturation and all that kind of stuff. But you know what? They have a huge response they have a huge effect on the EQ response. I mean, take a look at this. This is just, again, the default setting of the Oxide tape recorder from UAD. There's a massive boost in the sub low end, and a heavy enough presence boost. It's a broad boost that's not just, we're affecting 60 hertz and we're just boosting there. No, it's like the whole low end and the whole top end above like 5 or 6K is getting boosted, right? So it's no wonder that these things tend to glue everything together. Even something like a Pultec EQ. This is essentially just a tube-based EQ that just has these super broad EQ curve bells and just gives you this kind of smooth response. But even in its default setting, you can see that above like 2000 hertz, there's a presence boost of like one decibel, and it just kind of rides out the whole highs. It's not necessarily that it's doing anything crazy, but having your signal go through all these different types of either emulations or pieces of hardware, each one affects the sound EQ wise in a different, minor but different way. And all that together, I guess, would kind of compile into what people would characterize as, an analog sound. That takes us to consoles, and that console sound. People say that if you mix every channel with an SSL channel strip or something like that you're going to get this glue and continuity because, all the channels have been processed with the same equipment and it's going to sound more together. And we can kind of take a look at that. So here's a SSL channel strip from Brainworks that I've been using recently. Great channel strip. I can't recommend it more highly. But as you can see, just on the default setting, there's a slight roll off in the subs. And other than that, it's pretty flat, which is all good. But when you're EQing on a console, you're not being surgical with it. Like, that's kind of the thing about the analog sound. It's not surgical little EQ moves to try to make things as pretty and perfect and mathematically correct as possible. It's a broad stroke. And that broad stroke is kind of what helps everything glue together, in my opinion. As you can see here, we've basically boosted 6 decibels at 8K. But in the EQ curve response, you can see that, we've got a boost extending all the way down to like 1K, even a little bit beneath that. Like, it's it's up at 810K where we said we wanted to boost, and that's all fine, but there's movement all the way down into the low mids. Like it's wild. The same thing with like a 60 hertz boost. This is a shelf at 60 hertz. It's boosting everything up to like 300-400K. And that's, you turn up a knob on an SSL and wow, that really made a big difference. Yeah, because it's not just doing a small narrow bell at the frequency that you chose to try to fix an issue. It's moving stuff, right? And if you're processing everything with these kind of broad strokes of EQ, you end up with a natural sound that is going to mix well with everything else. I've got a Tascam M1516 16 channel mixing console here in the studio that I love to basically take my submixes and my buses and just run all my buses kind of as like a stem mix at the end of when I'm mixing a track, just to kind of get that feel of the console and get that kind of sound in there. And this is basically what the EQs are. On the left there you can see I have a low, a sweepable mid, and a high. In this instance I have the high boosted, and as you can see it's supposed to be a 10K boost, but that's boosting everything up to like 200-300 hertz, and especially once you hit like 2K it's already like a 3 dB boost. It's such a broad stroke. It's basically presence, right? Everything makes it brighter, makes it quieter, makes it duller. It's really not a precise thing. Same thing with like this is supposed to be a 100 hertz shelf. On the lows, you can see I've boosted lows here. It's boosting everything to like 500 hertz. And everything is going, together, up and down. If you add a couple points of EQ on this, it's just gonna do all kinds of stuff. And it's such a contrast to like a digital EQ plugin where you can get really surgical and we're notching out little frequencies here and there. No, the analog sound is so many things, but in terms of EQ response, it really seems that the analog sound kind of boils down to kind of a lo-fi-ish roll off of highs and lows with really broad strokes on the EQ. It's not surgical. It's all about the wide bands, and kind of dialing things into taste rather than looking at things mathematically. And yes, there may be things like saturation, soft knee compression, and tube transformer, those kinds of sounds. But in terms of EQ response, actually looking at it on the screen, it's all about the broad strokes and how they boost and cut in ways that you're not really expecting, but they're made to do it, and it sounds pretty good. So what have we learned today? What is the analog sound, which is what we were exploring? It's many things, but in terms of measurable EQ response, it seems to be you're painting with a very, very wide brush. It's not about tiny little precise moves. It's about the broad picture that you can paint on a macro scale. It's about using wide bands to EQ your music and craft your tones to make sure that you can get as cohesive of a sound as possible. Does it imprint some sort of immeasurable warmth? Probably, but I don't know how to measure that. So in terms of EQ response, this is what we've got. Bottom line, don't be scared to be heavy-handed when you're EQing your stuff, because you'll get a more analog sound the heavier handed you are. Thanks everybody for watching. Thanks for dropping by. I hope you guys learned something. I know over the last couple months of screwing around down here, I have learned a few things about the analog sound. Please leave me a like if you liked the video, and leave me a comment if you've got something to say about it. What is the analog sound to you? What am I missing here? And what can I do to kind of help better explain this to you guys in a way that's helpful? So, hope you enjoyed. Have a good rest of the day, and see you later. Thanks for watching Spin Cycle Studios.
Spin cycle.